So, what do you say when you're on a call and a prospect says something to the tune of, "It all sounds great, but before I get started, I want to speak to someone you work with"? Or, "Can I speak to some references? Or can I speak to some existing clients?" I still remember the exact call where I decided that playing that game was enough. And I was selling a business coaching package, but it was targeted at contractors, builders, that sort of thing. And this guy had already done it to me before, and I was still playing nice, still doing the right thing. And this is the second or third time he'd found a way to get off the call. And I remember I was a little bit frustrated, which doesn't happen much on calls. And he goes, "Oh, can I just speak to someone you already work with?" And I said, "No, actually, we don't do that anymore." And reason being, even if we go to the effort and connect someone with an existing client, we take our time, connect, and then our existing client takes their time. Without fail, they never end up moving ahead, regardless of what our client says, because obviously they're going to give glowing reviews. They're not going to go ahead because there's something that we haven't spoken about. There's something that we haven't covered yet. And I watched back that call a couple of times because I remember it came out of a position of almost frustration with this guy for messing me around. But then it kind of clicked of, well, I don't actually have to play the game. I don't. And I use a version of that consistently to this day because that question in itself, I don't ever connect to client anymore. I haven't in years. That question in itself, it's just a smokescreen because at the end of the day, there's nothing that an existing client is going to give them as long as your marketing and your website is somewhat decent. If you're completely unknown, obviously there's going to be questions, but there's not really anything that your client will be able to give the prospect that they don't already have. And I'll give you another example. So one of the things that I sell at the moment, now this was a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that I sell at the moment, it's a VA service to medical professionals, as in clinic owners, specialists, everything like that. And I was speaking to the business manager, and last minute she checked in with the owner who wasn't there, even though she'd been given authority, and she double checked with him, and he said, "Last second, I want to speak to someone they work with." So we all hopped on a call the next day, and it was an early morning call. I think it was about 6:30 before everything kicked off. And he said, "I just want to speak to someone that you work with." And I said a very similar thing. I said, "We used to do that, but the CEO decided that it's not something we're going to do anymore because what happens usually is we'll go to all of the effort, we'll connect that person with someone we've already worked with, and that person will sometimes try and take 30 minutes of our client's time. And as you understand, the kind of people that come to work with us, they come to work with us because they want to spend less time doing admin tasks, and it's unfair of us to ask them to do the work for us. So what we did instead is we just have a really open and honest conversation. And we'll have a chat about essentially what you're hoping that that client will be able to tell you that you don't already know. And it may be that we end up in a position where we decide not to work together. We can't get past it, and that's okay. But let's do that. Let's have a really open and honest conversation and see where we end up. So what are you hoping to talk to that client about that you haven't already covered? And then this is where it came out. Because when they want to speak with a client, it's because they want to dance around a topic that they're not quite comfortable enough to actually touch on. And this was an Australian client, and he lived in a very regional area. Now, he never would have mentioned this to the client, but what it got down to is VA services typically overseas, and he was really worried about their accents. And the reason he was worried about their accents is regional Australia. There are certain areas that are very regional. You can't say it politely. They can be quite racist in some spots. And he was really worried about how his patients, about how the people that ring in, they're going to react to getting someone with an accent. What does their accent actually sound like? Is there going to be kickback? Because he just said that we've never had that before, and he was actually really nervous. He did ask about their accents, and I was able to read between the lines and pull that out. But even if we connected him to a client, he never would have asked that. 2 minutes later, we'd gone through that. Essentially, he gets to vet all of the applicants. He gets to choose. He gets to make sure that he's comfortable with it. And we unpacked everything. We were comfortable. He thanked me for my time. He was smiling. He was really excited to get started. That was all in 2 minutes of questions and maybe a minute or two of unpacking. So we'll round it up to about 5 minutes. That is 1/10 or less or more of what it would take for me to connect him with a client. And he wouldn't have ended up going ahead anyway, because that was the apprehension that he had. So what I'm getting at here, when this happens, I think there are very, very few exceptions to the rule. And even I started on an offer a few years ago and they said, no, we do it sometimes. This is a big deal. They need to speak to existing partners or existing clients. They'd never get started. There'd always be a reason. They spoke to their financial planner. They spoke to this person. They spoke to that person. A lot of the time they wouldn't even show. It's just an excuse to get off the call. And I would much, much rather get to that now than waste the client's time, than waste my time, and just waste everyone's time. So that's my process. That's my process for unpacking it. But the thing that I understand is that's very me. That's very my process. I have a way of asking really hard questions and disarming people. But let's go through a couple of different ways. So if they say, for example, I'd like to speak to someone that you work with, and I'll ask them a question. Do you mind if I ask you a question? And they'll say, yeah. And you say, you sure? You're probably not going to like it. We do a little accusation audit. Just have them prepared. And they'll say, yep, go ahead, just ask. And then I'll say, well, look, I've been on a lot of these calls, and I can tell you without fail, when someone asks to speak to someone that we've already worked with, they never end up coming on board regardless of how highly the client speaks of us, because there's usually something else that we haven't spoken about or covered that's a red flag or something that is just a massive handbrake from their end. And that's okay. If it's a no, it's a no. And we can part the call as friends. But the question I have, what are you hoping that a client will say that we haven't already covered or that you haven't already seen? What have we missed? And then the truth will come out. And the reason that's so much softer is you've added 2 layers. You've done an accusation audit, and they're not going to be upset if you just come out and actually say that. Those are my go-tos. Those are the ones that have worked very well for me. And the one takeaway from this video, don't immediately connect them with an existing client. And when you're early in your sales career, it's the easy thing to do. You can chuck them in the pipeline. You can tell the sales manager you got this coming in. They've just got to speak to an existing client. Don't fall into that trap. It's lazy and it's wasting everyone's time. Don't bypass it. I hope this was helpful. I know it has helped me a lot, and it's still something I'll use as soon as someone brings it out, which at this point's roughly every 1 to 2 weeks. And yeah, hopefully you can implement it on some of your calls.